I'm joined on India Today live and exclusive at this time by one of the world's leading risk gurus. Joining us is Ian Bremmer, American political scientist, author, entrepreneur, founder, president of the Eurasia Group, and really one of the world's top experts on risk. Thank you very much, Ian, for joining us. I want you to start by explaining to our viewers, as best as you understand, how the Hamas was able to pull off an attack of this magnitude against one of the most sophisticated armed forces in the world, which has an intelligence service which is the envy of other countries. How could Hamas stage this attack? Why couldn't the Israelis stop it?
It's true. When you talk about Israel, not just their intelligence, their surveillance capabilities, their human capabilities on the ground in the occupied territories, also their border security, really it's considered the gold standard. But the Israelis took their eye off the ball. For the last 6 months, Israel has been consumed in a constitutional crisis. No one's been talking about the concerns of the Palestinians, certainly not in Gaza, certainly not Hamas. Instead, it was massive internal demonstrations, which included many members of the Israeli Defense Forces, some of whom said they wouldn't actually serve if the judicial reforms went ahead. Also, Prime Minister Netanyahu was himself focused on expanding settlements in the West Bank. And indeed, many battalions of the Defense Forces were sent to the West Bank and to the surrounding border areas, in part to help ensure stability given those settlements, and also to deal with the sometimes violent reprisals, demonstrations, attacks that had come from Palestinians in the occupied West Bank. In other words, there was very little focus on Gaza and Hamas. There was a feeling of confidence, even in the days before the attacks, from Israel's defense leaders that there was no war being planned, that Palestinians and Hamas were bottled up. This was not a priority. This was not a concern. Now, that combined with clearly an extraordinary amount of training on the part of these Hamas militants. This was something I would say they probably would have been planning for years, not just months. Those things combined really lead to unprecedented tragedy for the Israeli people.
Because some of these videos have actually been geolocated by our open source intelligence experts and others to areas just about 50 kilometers from the Israel border. So it's not as if they were out in a place where they couldn't be seen. Given the kind of capacity Israel has, it almost seems as if this is one of the biggest intelligence failures in decades that Israel has to deal with.
Yeah, it's pretty clear that, again, the presumption of the Israeli government was that the Palestinian issue didn't really matter. No one was focusing on a two-state solution. No one was focusing on negotiations. Netanyahu and his far-right coalition partners, their view was the Palestinians are no longer a fundamental threat. The Israelis have basically won. So indeed, they could take more territory for an expanding Israeli population in the West Bank. And the conditions for Palestinians, particularly in Gaza, were becoming worse and worse and worse. 50% absolute poverty, some 70% without access even to clean water. And in this environment, the necessity of the Israelis to be absolutely focused on national security, on the borders, on intelligence collection, you'd think that would be even more essential. But of course, Israel has been just consumed with domestic challenges to their own democracy. So really, this is a case of a very sophisticated and well-resourced Israeli defense capability that has taken its eye off the ball. And certainly Prime Minister Netanyahu, his legacy now will be these attacks, the Hamas attacks.
The Israel Defense Forces have said that there will be a war with Hamas. What form and shape do you see that war take? We're already seeing heavy aerial fire, the Air Force artillery mortars being used. So far, Israel has held back from a ground offensive because that would cause a lot of devastation in the Gaza Strip, also death to Israeli armed personnel. Do you now think that is inevitable? And if there is a ground invasion, how is that likely to go?
I do think it's inevitable, but there are a few other things that are going on. You also have a siege that was announced a few hours ago by the Israeli defense minister. No more gas, no more food, no more water, nothing getting into Gaza going forward. Already a crippling poor territory. Remember, some 2.2 million Palestinians actually live in Gaza. You also have well over 100, possibly as many as 160, 170, I'm hearing, hostages that have been taken, Israeli civilian hostages that are in Gaza. And certainly the top priority for the Israeli Defense Forces right now will be to secure those hostages and get them back safely. That's an incredibly difficult thing to do. But beyond that, there will be ground strikes. There will be house-to-house warfare. There will be an effort by the Israelis to remove Hamas leadership, to kill them, to capture them, also to disarm Hamas militants. And that probably means a fairly long occupation, a very bloody occupation, one that will lead to enormous casualties for the Palestinians on the ground. The big question is whether this war expands beyond Israel and Gaza to include the West Bank and also to include other countries. That has not
So I'll come to that in just a moment. I want to stick for a moment just to the attack. Do you think, how much time do you think it might take for the IDF to be able to establish control on the Gaza Strip, given that it's a hostile population, many of whom will fight back? It's densely populated, and it won't be easy for Israel to occupy that area by force.
No. I mean, they're not going to establish full control. There's always going to be an insurgency. The question is, how much do the Israelis want to have a destruction of Hamas leadership as a singular goal, and how much do they want to ensure greater levels of direct occupation? I mean, I don't think they've made this decision yet, and perhaps they won't make the decision until they see how the military operations proceed. But certainly on the table as a potential outcome would be a permanent occupation of Gaza. I think that right now the Israelis are in trauma. They're shocked. I suspect that they're making more tactical decisions than they are thinking about what they're going to be facing in 3 months' time.
Let's now come to the question of escalation. We've seen some mortar firing by the Hezbollah, which saw Israeli artillery counteroffensive. Is the Hezbollah likely to get involved? Do you see this potentially spread even further to involve Iran?
So far, Hezbollah has been very cautious. Of course, the political statements completely support Hamas. But as you said, only some rocket attacks against a military facility, which the IDF responded to. That's it. So clearly right now, Hezbollah is saying this is Hamas's fight. Iran is saying they had nothing to do with it. They're saying this is Hamas's fight. Now, of course, Iran has been very publicly supportive of Hamas. Iran has provided military support for Hamas historically. But the United States government has said, as of a few hours ago, that there is no evidence, no hard evidence that the Iranians are directly involved. So clearly the Americans are telling the Israelis for now that there is no justification for escalating this war into Iran. The Americans also sending a fleet to the region to show Israel that the Americans have their back. So it's a warning to the Iranians, but it's also a warning to the Israelis. And I just, as of right now, there's pressure not to allow this war to escalate beyond Israel and Gaza.